Hello, my name is Hakon and welcome back to another little music tech tutorial. Today I've left the Zoya off to one side. I'm not using that today, but if you have watched my last two videos with the Empress Effects Zoya, you will have noticed quite heavily featured in those is the DJ Tech Tools MIDI Fighter Twister. Now this is an amazing MIDI controller, and I am going to talk a little bit about it today. And then in later videos, I will specifically talk more about how to integrate this with the Empress Effects Zoya specifically. But today, generally, it's just going to be about the Fighter Twister. Now, it was made, I think, around, or it released around 2014, so 6 years ago, 6.5 years ago, as I'm making this video, but it still is one of the best controllers on the market, I believe. It has quite a few special features that make it stand above the rest, or at least all the other ones that I've had an in-depth look at when I've been considering purchases of MIDI controllers. It was originally conceived as very specifically as a controller that would be the perfect partner for Native Instruments Tractor, quite a popular software, I believe, with DJs. And of course, it is designed by and for working DJs as a performance controller for somebody doing DJing, or as a performing musician as well, of course. In the same sort of breath, you could say that the features that a DJ needs would also make it quite suitable for a musician trying to control other equipment with a MIDI controller. So let's start talking about some of the features. First, it's quite a small, compact box. It has a MIDI connector, and it comes with a nice angled MIDI plug here as well, MIDI cable, not too long, but long enough for most users. It has 16 high quality encoders that have a very nice, smooth action to them. Around the encoders, there's a ring of lights here that shows you exactly where your encoder is positioned. And additionally, there's another secondary light here that shows you, which you can use to indicate what the controller does. For instance, you can have your own system of colors to organize what's doing what. And it's very easy to edit this. I'll show you the editing software in a moment. Each encoder is also a push button, and it has a secondary function as well that you can define in the software. On the sides, very highly rubberized sides, it has 3 extra buttons on each side. You can also assign to absolutely anything. The default is that the middle buttons on the side scroll through 4 different banks of controls. So this is not just 16 knobs. Each knob can do 2 different things, so you can think of them as 32 knobs. But you have that times 4. So 32 times 4, and you get 128 controllers in a very compact and easily organizable and easy to use interface. So it has already quite a lot going for it that other MIDI controllers don't, because in other knob-based MIDI controllers or in MIDI controllers that have knobs as well as sliders or keys, most of the time a knob is just doing one thing and one thing only, and you just set it to a MIDI channel either by MIDI learn or you have a definition set up, and that's it, and that's all it does. But on the MIDI Fighter Twister, it can do so much more. So we'll get into all the details of how you can set it up in a moment. But it's built like a tank. It's nice rubberized grip. It's got very nice rubberized knobs and you can replace these with colored ones as well. If you want to have a color system in addition to the light colors, you can have a system of colored knobs, and you can just take them on or off as needed. It comes in black or white, and it just looks and feels really sturdy, very comfortable to use, and quite good. Now, one thing it does lack, and which would have been nice to have, certainly at the price point it is, because it is quite an expensive controller, would have been DIN MIDI inputs and outputs and throughputs, but it's only got USB. So if you want to connect it to a device that is DIN MIDI only, you need to either use an audio interface or MIDI interface, an audio interface with MIDI, or a MIDI interface for the computer to connect it via. Or if you want to work completely out of the box like I do, you can get a Midi USB host like this one from Kenton here, which has a USB input, or actually it's not just an input, it's an input and output, and a DIN MIDI in and out, so you can communicate to and from a USB MIDI device like the Midi Fighter Twister. So that's what I use when I connect it to my Empress FX Zoya, for instance. Right, so that's just the basic overview of the hardware. So brilliant knobs, very comfortable both to push and to rotate, and a very nice visual feedback, although you can actually do different things with the feedback, and I'll talk about that in a moment as well. Okay, so let's have a little look at the setup software. So I'm going to put that up on the screen now. And here it is. And it's called the Midi Fighter Utility. Current version, I believe, is the 285, it says there, and also it looks like my firmware of the Fighter Twister was updated to October 2019. So there has been updates since it was new. I don't know exactly what the updates have been, but you update it through the utility software, which is extremely easy to use. So what this does is give you full control of each and every single controller on this, and for all 4 pages. So first of all, we have over here, it says bank 1, 2, 3, 4. And so you can set up each page individually. Okay, so let's have a look at the settings. Now there is a encoder settings or global settings. I'm not going to say too much about the global settings, just go through it very quickly. There is a mention here of a super knob start point and end point. I will get back to that in a few moments. There's a brightness controls, system MIDI channel, which is, I'm not actually sure about the system MIDI channel because each of the knobs, of course, has their own MIDI channel setting. So I'm not sure what that actually does. And the manual doesn't seem to mention it either. Now, this is also where you set the controls for the side keys, or the side buttons. At the moment, I'm keeping them at the default. I'm only using the left and right to middle buttons to swap through the banks on the Midi Fighter Twister, and I think that's what I'll keep them to for now, and I'll leave all the other controls for the encoders themselves. Now, of course, if you are working with other equipment, there might be other things you may want to use these for, but they are definable in the system. Right, let's go to the encoder settings. This is where the interesting things start to happen. So for each of these encoders, on each of the 4 pages or the 4 banks, you have individual settings that you can define in the setup. So you can do, for instance, there's a color, and there's a little palette of colors up here. So I can make this one, for instance, have an there's an off color and an on color, and by that it means that when the switch has not been toggled on the encoder, that is the off color, and when it has been toggled, it gets the on color. So now the off color is red, the on color is green. And I like using different colors for different pages because it makes it easier for me to tell right away at a glance which page I'm on, and so I don't confuse them, which could happen if you use the same colors, or if you don't use colors at all. You can indeed also have colors off if you like on these pages. So that is this one there. Okay, so now I've changed one color now to yellow on the off color. That does not show up right away on the Fighter Twister, but if I now push send to MIDI Fighter, and it will update very quickly, and you see it has changed now to the new setup. That's how quick it is to change the settings. Right, let's have a look at the details of these settings now. Let's start from the top. So it has detent is the first one there. And that means if you want a detent, you have a sort of a center detent. So I'll just click that now. And it doesn't come up right away. I'll just send to MIDI Fighter now, so we can have a little look. Okay, so now when you select has detent, it will start in the middle instead of at the bottom. The controller usually starts on 0 and it goes to 127, but if you select has detent, it will start at 64, the middle value, and that middle value will also will snap to the middle value, so you can see when it is selected, and it will also have a different color, which I'm not sure you can see so well now in this light. You can change the color as well. I'll just change it now to 0, which is red, and maybe that is more visible. I'm not sure it is in this light. Let's see. Well, I'll have to send it now first. Okay, send to MIDI Fighter. Okay, now it's red, and that should be a little bit more visible than the violet that was the default. So I like keeping it in red because it is more visible. So now you can see every time it snaps to the middle value, it is red. So now that is value 64, and then we have still 0 down there, and we have 127 up there. Well, this is great for controlling things, of course, that has a bipolar value, so it goes down to minus or up to a positive value. So many things you might want to use that for, like for instance a balance control, blends, etc., things like that. So let's just switch that off for now. Okay, let's talk about sensitivity now. I'll keep it on velocity sensitive, but the default is high resolution, and I'll show that to you now. So if I do send to MIDI Fighter, so high resolution, and I'll just try to keep my fingers in the same place now, so we can see how that moves. So that is half a turn, and that is a full turn, and so roughly the whole range from 0 to 127 is one full turn of the knob. So about 360 degrees, probably exactly 360 degrees. The responsive is the second one, and let's send that to the MIDI Fighter now. And this is supposed to be, I think, that the knob moves exactly the same as the values now. So let's have a little look and see. So I'm turning, so now it's sort of pointing that way, and I'm doing this, and it looks like sort of, actually it's a little bit less even. So I'm turning it, I think 270 degrees is a full going from 0 to 127. I have found, certainly on using it with the Zoya, that using responsive mode is very hard to get every single MIDI value sent out, and it has a tendency to skip values very easily. So I don't use that. In high resolution mode, it's easier to get every single value, and then it's velocity sensitive, which is the one I usually use. Let's send that to the MIDI Fighter now. And now the idea is that the faster you turn the knob, the faster the values go up. So if I want to move really fast, I can do fast like that, and it goes up to the max. If I want to have a fine resolution, I can move it slowly. And this, if you notice, is even slower than the high resolution mode. So actually, if you want to be able to select specific values, this is the best mode. So if I move it slowly now, I'll just start like that. And so there we have half a turn and a full turn, 1.5, 2, 2.5, 3, almost 3.5 turns actually to go the whole range when you move it slowly. And when you move it fast, I'm not sure how fast is the max. Let's just try to do it like so. Okay, so that is about half a turn actually on the knob is the full range if you move it really fast. So that is by far, I think, the best way to use it, because the other modes, it is very easy to skip values. When I use it with my Zoya and I see the values come up on the screen, if I use anything but velocity sensitive, it is easy for it to miss a value. And sometimes you need an exact value, for instance, when you're working with note values. So velocity sensitive, by far my favorite, and I think it might be yours as well if you try that. So those are the sensitivity modes. Indicator type is how the indicator shows up on your fighter twister, and there is 3 modes. Blended bar, I think, is the default. Blended bar, that means it's showing the whole range as you get to it, but it also, each new step is sort of gradually fading in until it gets its full brightness, and the next step starts fading in. And I'm not sure you can see that so well in this light. In fact, I should probably reduce my exposure a little bit so you can see these things better. So if I do like that, so now you can see it better, I think, how it fades in. Yeah, I think that is better. So it slowly fades in each new step, like so. And then there is dot, which only shows a single dot indicating the location of the encoder, and this is full brightness right away. So I'll move it slowly now, and then we get the second dot there, and then it's up to third dot, etc. Fourth, and there we are. So that is obviously quite a sort of point of preference. One nice thing about the dot mode is that if you know exactly what each of these values is, when the dot comes on, you know exactly what the value of the encoder might be, or what range it is in, very precisely. So I think it can be useful. It's one of those I will consider using in some cases, because sometimes I want to know exactly what it is. For instance, if I were to control just the note value of a sequencer step, and I wanted to know exactly whether it was a C or a C sharp or a D or whatever it was, and I could actually visually see that would be quite useful sometimes. Or I want to know how, is this transposition control, and I set up each of these dots to mean exactly one step, then of course I know that when it's here, it's one step transposed, 2 steps, 3 steps, 4 steps, 5 steps, etc. So it is useful to have it for that, and I'll get into that again when I look at how to use the MIDI fighter twister with the Zoya, because there are use case scenarios where that can be really useful to have as a visual feedback. And then there is bar, which means it doesn't blend in. Oh, hang on, I have to send it now. Which of course also looks quite nice, and you can also tell exactly how far it is up the scale. So like dot, but you get the whole range visible, which can be visually quite pleasing as well to see the whole range. Right, the next function here is something called enable superknob. And superknob is, as far as I know, it's a MIDI fighter twister unique thing. What it does is it allows you to control two things on one knob, but not by pushing it and sort of holding it down, but by letting part of the range of a single encoder do a secondary function. Of course, on the MIDI fighter twister, you're talking about primary and secondary functions on each controller for each bank. And what that means is that when it is in its off state, like now, when you rotate it, the values are the primary encoder values and control values. And usually when you push it down, then you get secondary control values, either just the push button itself or the value that you can set after having pushed it if you set it up like that. But there's also another way of controlling the second function, the second value, is by enabling a superknob. And when you have superknob enabled, this doesn't actually show visually, I think, on the display now. It would have been nice if actually once you get to the superknob stage that you got some kind of visual feedback. That's the only thing I can think of that actually is lacking from the MIDI fighter twister. But you can define in the global settings, you can define superknob start point and end point. So exactly what values superknob starts at. And so now it is set to 63 starting point and 127 end point, which means that when your controller gets to 63, which is almost at the top here, that means that the secondary value that is controlled by this knob in that bank starts sending out a value of 0. And then it will go through its range of 0 to 127 in the defined space. So that means that from the top here to the end, it will send out values from 0 to 127. And at the same time, the controller 1 will send out values from 64 now to 127 as well. So two controls at the same time on the same rotating knob. So this can be useful in some cases. So it's quite an interesting thing. It's a shame that you can't get a visual feedback on it as part of the software, or the firmware. But it is still a nice function to have, and of course you will know about it if you use it. That's another thing that I'll just mention quickly, is that by not having too many knobs, I mean, there are things like the Duffer Drehbank, for instance, where you have even more knob controllers and others with sort of 64 encoders. Of course, the advantage of having that many is one of them is only doing one thing and you can put a little label on it. On the MIDI fighter twister, it's so easy to remember where each control is because of 4x4. It's such a small number of encoders to keep track of, so it's very easy for the locations of your controls to become muscle memory. Even within a few seconds of starting to use it, you sort of remember where things are, which is great, I think. So I think that's it's almost an optimum number, I think, of encoders to make it easy to use. If you have fewer, of course, it's easier to know where things are, but then again, you don't have control of as many things on the same page, as it were, of control. So superknob, that's what superknob is. Quite a clever little thing, and probably a feature that was requested, I suppose, by the people who had creative input for the fighter twister, or who had, or indeed the ones who were designing it themselves, thought that that was something they wanted in their way of using a controller. Now we come to the next one, which is quite an important one, switch action type. And that means what happens when you push an encoder. And there are a few options there. So what I usually set mine to is CC toggle, which means that when I push down the encoder now, it has toggled the secondary value is toggled to 1. So that's an on-off switch, basically. But there are a few other ones that are quite useful as well. CC hold. I'll just show you that now. So CC hold, instead of toggling, it doesn't stay on. When you push down an encoder now, it sends out a value of 1 on the secondary control. And then when you release it, it sends out a value of 0. So very useful. So a momentary push button. Then we have note hold, and of course that's another thing. This isn't, of course, an ideal keyboard, but you can use the fighter twister as a keyboard, and note hold means it sends out a note value. I actually haven't experimented with how it works as a keyboard, but so can't say too much about it, but the idea is when you're holding it, it sends out a note value, and when you release it, it stops sending it. Now, of course, you may not want to use this as a keyboard per se. There are also lots of, for instance, virtual instruments that use key switching. And sometimes remembering what key switches do what and where they are, it can be a bit of a hassle when you're playing them. And also when you transpose a keyboard that has fewer than 88 keys, sometimes they shift around as well. So it might be a good idea to actually set up a page of control, or part of a page, on the MIDI Fighter Twister to control key switches on your virtual instruments. Just an idea for you there that I think I'm going to use. It will make it easier to remember what the different ones do, because it's so much easier to keep track of than a note keyboard key switch. So that's note hold. Then there is note toggle. So when you push it down, it stays. Oh, I have to send it now. I keep forgetting. So when you push it down, it stays on. So now if I'm sending a note value of C1, for instance, that is continuously sent out of the controller as long as that is toggled. Then we have reset encoder value. This is quite a useful one, actually. So you can imagine that I'll have to send this now. Okay, so you can imagine that you have set a value of something that is meant to be a temporary value, and you want to quickly just go back to 0. And in this mode, you can just click it, and when you click it, the value goes back to 0. So in this case, you don't actually use 2 controllers on one knob anymore. You'd use just one controller value output, but you get the useful control of being able to reset a value just by clicking it very quickly. So that's quite a useful thing as well for music performance and DJing, indeed. Encoder fine adjust. Of course, that's not as useful if you use the velocity sensitive setting as I do. Basically, it just means that I'll just send that now. Maybe if I put it to responsive now, just to sort of show you the contrast a little bit. So this is the normal responsive way of moving the values, so you can see how that works. And then when you push it down and rotate, it is much slower. In fact, it's very much like, I think it might be even slower than the velocity sensitive one. But again, because this is a 7-bit controller, it's only got 128 values. You don't need that fine control usually. If this had been a 14-bit MIDI controller, that would have made so much more sense, but it is only 7-bit. So I would recommend, again, keeping it on velocity sensitive, and you don't need the encoder fine adjust, I don't think, because then you have very fine adjustment already. Then it is Shift Encoder Hold, and this is quite a useful one. So this gives you the secondary encoder value, the secondary output from the same knob, when you hold it. So I'll show you first. I'll set a value on the primary encoder now. So now it's set up there. And if I push it down, you see the lights went off there. The green light comes on, showing that this is on, and I can set another value here. And then I release it, and you can see the primary value is there, and the secondary value is there. So you've got two values, and you can set them individually by pushing down the button. And the last one is Shift Encoder Toggle, which means that instead of having to push it every time you set the secondary value, you can just, I have to send to Midi Fighter now. So you set one value there, and now we can just push it, and it's in the secondary encoder mode, and I can set that value, and I can toggle it back on toggle between them. And this is the one I found the easiest to use if I'm using a secondary, if both of the controls are supposed to be encoders. This is the one I use. So the two that I use the most are this mode here, and also the CC toggle, where you just use it as a toggleable push button. So I think those are the most useful. So but it all depends exactly how you're intending to perform with the Midi Fighter Twister as a musical instrument, I guess, in a way, because that's what a controller is when you think about it. So it is very individual how you like to use it, and so Midi Fighter Twister, it gives you the opportunity to set it up exactly the way you want. And moreover, you don't have to set this for all the controllers. You can set each and every single controller on every single of the 4 pages individually to have different settings when it comes to responsiveness, control, colors, exactly what happens when you push it down. You can set it up to your heart's content, and it's extremely easy to do. You can also edit multiple at once, and just on a single page, not on multiple pages. And you do that by pushing multiple down in the corner here. And then you select the ones you want to change, and you have the different settings over here, and you can set them to different of the settings. Not all the settings are available actually in this case, but most of them are. For instance, detent color is not available, which is a bit of a shame, because that means if you want to set all the detents to red, you have to set them up each one at a time. But that's another little sort of tiny little oversight perhaps that there is in the system, but I don't mind. It's fine. I don't use the detent very often, in fact. So but if I were to use that a lot, I would set up all the detents to be red because it is most visible, and I would save that as a preset. So you can edit multiple at once, which is quite useful. And then to stop editing multiples, you can press cancel. And of course, multiple editing is also possible to do with the colors, which is very useful, because normally, at least the way I do it, I set up a different color for each page rather than for individual sort of sets of controllers. But sometimes it is useful. For instance, there was the other day I was working with a 12-step sequencer, and so I had one color setup for the top 12 knobs, and then the bottom 4 knobs had 8 different controls for things that I wanted to adjust while playing the sequencer. So because I wanted to do everything on one page, which is easier than spreading it across multiple pages, but it is quite easy to swap between pages very quickly on the fly as you're going along. And it becomes second nature really quickly, because it's such an intuitive, tactile, and comfortable controller to use. So I'll press cancel now to go out of that. Now this is there we are. I'm in encoder settings. There we are. Okay, so now I'm still on this encoder up here, and now there's encoder MIDI type, and this is one that I haven't actually looked at all the possibilities here, but there is a note. So that means it gives out a note value. CC, that's your standard control code, MIDI control code. That's the one you will be using most of the time. There is something called ENC3FH418. I have no idea what that is. And there's switch velocity control. I also don't know what that is. Mouse emulation, I don't know how that works because I don't have any Mac OS devices at the moment. So if you're interested in those things, I suggest you look up the manual, which is available online from DJ Tech Tools. If you search for MIDI Fighter Twister manual or user guide, it will come up. Right, now the important things down here, and of course now they are set to defaults, is the encoder switch MIDI settings and encoder rotary MIDI settings, which is... That's one thing DJ Tech Tools actually, they're actually mixing up some terms every now and again. What they should have called it now is primary and secondary settings, because you can have a secondary setting that is also rotary. But you can't have a secondary setting that is a primary setting that is a switch, on the other hand. So they should have called them primary and secondary consistently, but I think they changed the sort of way of referring to it at some point during development, possibly after initial release as well. And so these names have stuck in the setup here. So what switch means is what happens, which controller setting is for the secondary controller when you push the button. For instance, if you have just a push button, what is the controller, the CC that gets the value of 1 if it is a switch like this, or which controller gets the value when it is like the first controller now, where you have 2 different encoders. And it has a specific MIDI channel. You can have 2 different channels, and you can have a MIDI number from 0 to 128. By default, page 1 of the MIDI Fighter Twister has channel 1, controller value 0 to 15 for the primary controller, and then for the secondary it is, I'll just do the secondaries now, so that's all secondary controllers, that is channel 2, 0 to 15. And then page 2 does from controller values 16 to 31, and then it's 32 to 47, and then 48 to 63 on the 4th page. And that is a default, and that's quite a useful default. It's the one I use, but sometimes you have equipment that responds very specifically to certain channels and certain CC value numbers. Now, there's one more thing I have to say now. In the user manual that I've got, which may not be the last version for the MIDI Fighter Twister, it calls the channels, the MIDI channels, 0 to 15, whereas in the setup now, I noticed that it is 1 to 16. So there's something happened along the way when it came to the MIDI standard, it seems, or the way that you refer to the channels on MIDI. It used to be 0 to 15, but these days it is the most common to refer to it as 1 through 16. And there still might be some equipment where there's a little bit of a mismatch between those 2 ways of referring to it. So your MIDI-enabled equipment that you want to connect the MIDI Fighter Twister to would have either a channels refer to channels as 0 to 15 or 1 to 16. The MIDI Fighter Twister used to call it 0 to 15, and now they call it 1 to 16. So if you are a bit unsure about how your connected device responds to MIDI channels, I would suggest just setting up a few controllers on different MIDI channels and then see what happens. A lot of equipment, for instance, is set to only respond to MIDI channel 1. They may or may not have a channel 0, so that might be channel 2 on the MIDI Fighter Twister. So just one thing to be worth of having in mind when you're setting it up. And of course, it is very easy to experiment now, because you can quickly save your settings, send to MIDI Fighter, and and then connect your equipment and see what happens. While I'm at it, I might as well say that to save your settings, there is an import and export settings up here. And so when you have a setup that works for you, push export settings, save it somewhere where you remember, and call it something that you will remember it by as well. So I would suggest just having it somewhere near your music project files. I'm sure everyone who does music, they would have a sort of a parent music or my music folder in which you could have a MIDI fighter folder as well for your setups for different things. Right, so the defaults are quite easy to get to grips with, and usually they are also the kind of MIDI default channels that are used by other equipment, and so it is quite easy to use them together. Right, another thing you can do with the MIDI fighter twister is, of course, you can send MIDI to it as well as sending it out from it. And when you do that, there are a few things you can do with MIDI input, and you can have other MIDI devices change the banks. You can have it change which of these pages is the active one by sending note values on channel 4, I believe. I have not tried this, but apparently that is supposed to work. Another thing you can do is to also override the color on the displays as well. You can change the color from an external MIDI device by sending a MIDI message on channel 2, I believe. If you send a value of 0, then the color here goes off. And if it is between 1 and 127, that is any other colors you see up here. So basically, this shows us up here the whole range of colors. So a 0 is black, and a 128 is sort of almost violet, deep purple, indigo-ish kind of color. And the whole rainbow in between really is not quite a rainbow order of colors. But it's these colors depending on the value. So if the middle value will give you around a sort of a lime green yellow color, for instance. I'm not going to show you that now because I haven't got anything connected to it, but you can change that. You can change it dynamically as well. For instance, you can have different things send back different colors to it. And also, in addition to that, you can send mini messages that animate the colors. And to animate the colors, you send that on channel 3, I believe, to the MIDI fighter twister. And you have different things. You can have the colors strobe, pulse, have a rainbow animation. And I still haven't tried that out so much. And again, I can't show you right now because I don't have anything connected to it, but take my word for it, it is possible. And it's one of those ways you can get visual feedback from other things on it. Now, it's another important way to get visual feedback is if you can imagine that some of these knobs will be used for values that can also be changed on what the MIDI fighter twister is connected to. So let's say we have this knob here set to a filter cutoff. Just, it could be anything, a filter cutoff. And you've also got another knob on a connected piece of gear that also does the same filter cutoff. So that's the one you're controlling with this one, but you might sometimes want to use the other knob, or you might accidentally use the other knob. If that other piece of equipment, whether it is a hardware or software as well, is able to send messages back to the MIDI fighter twister, then it can send its value to show up as the encoder value on the MIDI fighter twister. So you can get that kind of feedback. You can control it from 2 places. Again, I can't show you that right now because I don't have anything connected to it. And in order to do that, you send the value from the other equipment or to the MIDI fighter twister on channel 0 channel 1 actually. If it has channel 0, it's channel 0. If it is channel 1 to 16, it is channel 1. And that will bring up the values here, and it will be in sync with your other equipment. Now, you can't do that with everything, I presume, and sometimes you actually want your MIDI connection to do other things, but it is possible to do that, and it can give a very nice visual feedback. So you have the color can change, the animation of the color can change, and you can have MIDI messages also adjusting the values on the knobs. So there's so many things, and you can have external MIDI also change banks. So you can do so much going both ways between the MIDI Fighter Twister and other equipment. Of course that is channel, yes, and of course the another thing about that, so both all the color messages and for setting the values and the animation externally, they use the CC values that are the default for the Fighter Twister. So that means that in order to set the value of this knob here, whether it's the animation or the color from another piece of equipment, you have to use CC0, which is a default for the first knob on the first page. And so 0 to 15 you would use to control the lights animation effects and get a visual feedback from another piece of equipment to the MIDI Fighter Twister. And that cannot be changed. Those values are fixed, so that is part of the firmware of the MIDI Fighter Twister, how it responds to those MIDI messages, and you can't change that, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on what you how you feel about that. So that's it. I mean, it's incredibly versatile piece of hardware, and it can do so many things. And even though it is quite pricey, I think it is actually worth it if you want a controller that can do so much. I find it extremely useful as a performance controller for sequencing, for instance. The way I've used it in my videos recently, if you imagine this is a 16-step sequencer, I can set the note values like so, and then I can toggle steps on or off using the toggle switch functionality of the MIDI Fighter Twister. It is so useful and so easy to use, and you can change things on the fly. And then I would have a secondary page with different controls for the sound production, ADSRs, filter, etc., filters, envelopes, effects as well, reverb, delay, things like that. So it is just hugely versatile and practical controller, and nice, compact, solid, feels amazing as a performance instrument. And what else is there to say? It's brilliant. So I think that's it for today. I think I've said everything I wanted to say, and I do apologize that it's not as structured as perhaps it could be, because I don't have scripts when I do these videos. But I sort of try to use some of the structure from the utility now. But it is a brilliant controller, and I do recommend it. And I will say more about the MIDI Fighter Twister in future videos when I use it together with the Zoya, and I will be referring back to this video probably because I just wanted to go through what the MIDI Fighter Twister is and what it can do, and instead of having to explain all of that when I use it with the Zoya, I thought I'd just leave it for a separate video. And this might be interesting to someone also if they don't own a Zoya, indeed. So thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you found it useful and interesting. Please like, share, subscribe, join me on Patreon, all those things if you like what I do. And I will see you next time when I probably will make a video about how this works with the Zoya specifically. So stay tuned for that, and goodbye for now. Bye-bye.